We often think justice happens in a courtroom, but what happens when the judge becomes the accused? Today you will hear from Arthur, a man who spent 40 years sentencing others, only to face the ultimate verdict himself. He witnessed the shocking fate of religious leaders and stood on the fragile glass floor of hell. This isn't just a story. It is a terrifying warning from the other side of the gavel. Prepare your hearts. If this channel is a source of spiritual food for you, consider becoming a member today. By clicking the join button, you are not just supporting a video, you are helping us produce these high-quality testimonies that reach lost souls around the world. Stand with us, support the mission, and help us spread the truth.
I sit here in this leather chair, the leather cracked and worn just like the skin on my hands. The room is quiet. The only sound is the wind howling off the Atlantic, rattling the window panes of this old house in Portland. Outside, the world is gray and frozen. The snow is piled high against the fences, and the ocean is a churning mass of black water and white foam. It is cold, but I do not mind the cold anymore. I welcome it. The cold tells me I am still alive. The cold tells me I am not back in that place of suffocating heat. My name is Arthur. For 40 years I sat on a high bench, looking down at people. I was a judge. I wore the black robe. I held the wooden gavel. I listened to lawyers argue. I listened to witnesses cry, and I listened to juries deliver their verdicts. I was the man who decided the fate of others. I decided who went to prison. I decided who walked free. I decided who paid for their crimes and who was given a second chance. I was proud of my position. I thought I was the embodiment of justice. I thought I knew the difference between right and wrong better than anyone else in this city. But before I was a judge, I was something much simpler. I was a fisherman. From the time I was 16 until I was 25, I worked the decks of the trawlers out of the harbor. I know what it feels like to have salt freeze in your beard. I know the ache in your back after hauling nets for 12 hours straight. I know the smell of diesel and fish guts that never really washes off your skin. I worked hard. I pulled myself up from the bottom. I went to night school. I studied the law until my eyes burned. I became a man of respect, a man of power. I tell you this so you understand who I was. I was a man of logic. I was a man of evidence. If I could not see it, if I could not touch it, if I could not prove it in a court of law, it did not exist to me. I had no time for fairy tales. I had no time for religion. When I walked past the churches on Sunday mornings and saw the people lining up, I felt nothing but pity. I thought they were weak. I thought they needed a crutch to get through life. I did not need a crutch. I had the law. I had my mind. I had my gavel. I certainly never paid attention to Christian testimonies. If someone started talking about Jesus or salvation, I would politely excuse myself and walk away. Inside, I was laughing at them. I thought they were delusional. I thought they were afraid of the dark. I remember one time a woman stood up in my courtroom. She was the mother of a boy I was about to sentence to 20 years. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Judge, please have mercy. God is watching you." I looked at her with a face of stone. I told her that God was not in my courtroom. Only the law was in my courtroom. I banged my gavel, and I sent her son away. I was so arrogant. I was so blind. I thought I was the judge. I did not know that I was actually the accused. Now, at 78 years old, looking back at my life, I realized that I was building a prison for myself, brick by brick, with every arrogant ruling I made. I hear people talk about impactful testimonies on the internet now. I see my grandchildren watching videos on their phones, listening to evangelical testimonies of people who claim to have seen the other side. Years ago, I would have told them to turn that garbage off. I would have told them to study science, to study history, to study things that are real. But now I sit here and I listen. I listen because I know the truth. I know that those stories are not fairy tales. I know that hell is not a metaphor for a bad day. It is not a state of mind. It is a place. It is a real place. More real than this desk I am touching. More real than the cold wind outside. I know this because I went there. It happened 3 years ago. I was retired then. I spent my days reading biographies of great men, trying to convince myself that I was one of them. I was healthy for my age. I walked 3 miles every morning along the coast. I ate well. I did not smoke. I thought I had another 20 years left. I thought I was in control of my time. That is the greatest lie we tell ourselves, isn't it? We think we own our time. We think we can negotiate with death. I remember the morning clearly. It was November. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. I decided to walk down to the old docks, where I used to work as a fisherman half a lifetime ago. I liked to watch the young men working. It made me feel superior. I would watch them struggle with the ropes and the crates, and I would think to myself, I am glad I escaped that life. I am glad I became someone important. I was standing near the edge of the pier. The smell of the ocean was strong, that mix of salt and rot that defines the coast. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the icy air. I felt strong. I felt invincible. And then, it hit me. It wasn't a pain at first. It was a silence. It was as if someone had pressed a button and turned off the world. The sound of the seagulls stopped. The sound of the waves crashing against the pilings stopped. The shouting of the fishermen stopped. There was just a sudden, absolute silence. Then came the pressure. It felt like an elephant had stepped on my chest. It was a crushing, grinding weight that squeezed the air out of my lungs in a single second. I tried to gasp, but my throat was closed. I tried to grab the railing, but my hands would not obey me. I felt my knees hit the wooden planks of the pier. The wood was rough and cold. I saw a nail head sticking out of the plank, rusty and bent. I stared at that nail. It is funny what the mind focuses on in the final moments. I stared at that rusty nail and I thought, I need to file a report about this safety hazard. I was still a judge, even as I was dying. I was still trying to impose my order on the world. Then the darkness came. It didn't fall like night. It rose up from the ground. It swallowed the pier. It swallowed the ocean. It swallowed me. I have heard people talk about near-death experiences where they float above their bodies. They see the doctors working on them. They see the lights of the ambulance. They feel a sense of peace. They see a tunnel of white light, and they see their relatives waiting for them with open arms. They speak of love and warmth. That was not my experience. There was no floating, there was no peace, there was only a violent, ripping sensation. It felt like my soul was being torn out of my body like a stubborn tooth being pulled from a jawbone. It hurt. It was a spiritual agony that went beyond any physical pain I had ever known. I was being evicted from my own flesh. And then, I was falling. I was falling through a void that was heavier than gravity. I was falling away from the earth, away from the light, away from hope. And as I fell, the silence was broken. But it wasn't broken by the sound of angels or harps. It was broken by a sound that I can still hear in my nightmares. It was a low, constant vibration, like the hum of a massive machine, but it was made of voices, millions and millions of voices, screaming. I tried to tell myself I was dreaming. I tried to use my logic. I said to myself, Arthur, you are having a stroke. This is a hallucination caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain. Your neurons are firing incorrectly. This is not real. Wake up. But logic does not work where I went. The falling stopped with a brutal suddenness. I did not land on soft clouds. I did not land on a hospital bed. I landed on a floor that felt hard and hot. I opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was not the smell of the ocean. It was the smell of sulfur, yes, but mixed with something else. It smelled like burning hair. It smelled like old rotting paper. It smelled like a courtroom that had been sealed shut for 1,000 years with dead bodies inside. The air was dry and dusty, choking me with every breath. I stood up. I looked down at my body. I was wearing my black judicial robe. But it was not the fine silk robe I wore in the Superior Court. It was tattered. It was stained with something dark and oily. And it was heavy. It felt like it was made of lead. It dragged on my shoulders, pulling me down. I looked around. I expected to see fire. I expected to see the cartoon version of hell that people mock. Little red men with pitchforks, lakes of lava. But that is not what I saw. What I saw was far more terrifying because it was organized. It was structured. I was standing in a massive, cavernous hall. It looked like a cathedral, but a cathedral built by an insane architect. The pillars were thick and made of twisted iron that looked like human muscles flayed open. The ceiling was so high I could not see the top, lost in a swirling gloom of smoke and shadow. There were arches and balconies, all constructed from this rusted, bleeding metal. It was a mockery of a holy place. It was a temple of doom. And it was crowded. There were thousands of people. But they were not standing together. They were isolated in their own little spaces of torment, yet visible to everyone else. I saw men in business suits pacing back and forth, looking at watches that had no hands. I saw women in evening gowns clawing at their faces. But what drew my attention, what made my blood run cold, was the procession happening in the center of the hall. I walked forward. My feet felt heavy, as if the floor was magnetized. I wanted to run away, but I was compelled to look. I had spent my life looking at evidence. I had to see this. In the center of this iron cathedral there was a wide aisle, and walking down this aisle were men. They were walking slowly, with their heads held high, trying to maintain a dignity that did not exist here. I recognized their clothing immediately. I had seen these clothes in books, in the news, on television during high holidays. They were wearing robes, ornate, embroidered robes. Some wore the crimson of cardinals, some wore the purple of bishops, and some wore the white of the highest office. They wore the tall mitres on their heads. They carried staffs of gold. They wore heavy crosses around their necks. These were the men of God. These were the shepherds. These were the men who the world worshipped, the men who people kissed the rings of, the men who stood on balconies and blessed the crowds. I felt a shock of confusion. I thought, if this is hell, why are they here? Surely there has been a mistake. These are the holiest men on earth. I watched them, and as they walked closer to me, the horror revealed itself. From a distance, their robes looked like gold and silk. But as they passed me, I saw the truth. The gold embroidery on their vestments was not thread. It was molten metal. It was liquid fire that was moving, slithing through the fabric like glowing worms. It was searing into their skin. I could hear the sizzling sound. I could smell the cooking flesh. But they did not scream. They were trying to keep their composure. They were trying to act like they were still in charge. Their pride was so deep, so ingrained, that even in the fires of hell, they were trying to maintain the image of holiness. The heavy crosses around their necks were not symbols of salvation. They were massive weights, pulling their heads down. The metal was red hot, burning a ring around their necks. They were chained by the very symbols they had used to deceive the world. I saw a face I recognized. I will not say his name, but the world mourned him when he died. He was called a saint by the newspapers. He was praised for his charity, for his wisdom. I saw him walking in that line. His face was a mask of pure agony, but his eyes were full of hate. There was no love in him. There was no Jesus in him. He looked at me as he passed, and I saw a soul that had been completely consumed by vanity. He had loved the applause of men more than the approval of God. I backed away, terrified. I realized then that my black judge's robe was made of the same material. It was beginning to heat up. I felt the warmth on my shoulders. I felt the fabric tightening around my throat. I had spent my life judging criminals. I had looked down on thieves and murderers, but here I was, standing in the same line as the religious hypocrites. I was just another man in a robe who thought he was a god. The atmosphere in that place was heavy with fear. But it wasn't just the fear of pain, it was the fear of exposure. In my courtroom, people could lie, lawyers could twist the truth, evidence could be suppressed. But here, everything was naked. You could not hide who you were. I heard a voice inside my head, or maybe it came from the walls themselves. It said, "The verdict is read, the sentence is eternal." I wanted to object. I wanted to slam my gavel and call for a recess. I wanted to appeal to a higher court. But I knew, with a sinking dread that made my knees buckle, that I was already in the highest court, and the judge of this court was not me. I fell to my knees on the hot iron floor. The reality of testimonies of hell that I had mocked crashed down on me. I was not an observer. I was a participant. I was a prisoner. And the trial had just begun. I looked at the line of priests and popes again. They were marching toward a dark altar at the far end of the cathedral. A fire was burning there, but it gave no light, only heat. They were walking into it, one by one, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that I was expected to follow them. This was not a dream. This was the payment for a life lived without Jesus Christ. This was the end of the road for a man who thought he was the law, and the terror was only beginning. The floor of the iron cathedral began to vibrate, a low, rhythmic thrumming that I felt in my teeth and in the marrow of my bones. I wanted to stay on my knees. I wanted to curl into a ball and cover my head, to hide from the terrible grandeur of this place. But I could not. A force, invisible and irresistible, pulled me to my feet. It was not a physical hand. It was a command that bypassed my will. It was as if I were a puppet and the strings had been jerked upward. I was a judge who was used to ordering bailiffs to move prisoners. Now, I was the prisoner being moved. I was forced to walk. My legs moved stiffly, dragging the heavy, lead-lined robe across the hot metal plates. I was following the procession of the condemned clergy. The heat radiating from them was intense, like standing next to an open furnace door. The air shimmered around their bodies. I could smell the distinct, sickly sweet odor of scorching silk and burning skin. It was a smell that coated the back of my throat, tasting of copper and ruin. We moved toward the center of the cathedral, toward the dark altar I had seen from a distance. As we got closer, I saw that the altar was not made of stone or marble. It was a mound of blackened skulls, fused together by extreme heat, their empty sockets staring out at the congregation of the damned. Behind the altar, there was no cross. There was only a void, a tearing in the fabric of the dark reality, a black hole that seemed to inhale the very light of the room. The procession stopped. The figure I had recognized, the man who had been a global icon, whose face had graced magazine covers and television screens, stopped right in front of the altar. He turned around to face the darkness, his back to the void. I was standing only a few feet away from him now. I could see the details of his torment. It was horrifyingly intimate. In life, this man had a face that projected kindness. He had a soft smile that made people feel safe. But here, that face was a landscape of devastation. His skin was gray and papery, stretched tight over his skull. The tall, ornate mitre on his head, the symbol of his high office, was fused to his scalp. I could see where the gold band had melted into his forehead, the precious metal bubbling and dripping down his brow like yellow blood. He tried to wipe it away with a hand that was covered in jeweled rings, but the rings were red hot. Every time he touched his face, he burned himself further. He looked at me. For a second, our eyes locked. In that look, there was no holiness. There was no peace. There was only a desperate, starving hunger. He opened his mouth to speak. I expected a scream. I expected a plea for mercy. Instead, he tried to preach. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. His muscle memory, the habit of a lifetime of performance, kicked in. He raised his burning hands in a gesture of blessing. He opened his mouth to recite a Latin prayer, words I had heard him say on television 100 times, but no words came out. As he opened his mouth, a cloud of dry, gray ash billowed out. He choked. He gagged. He tried to say, "In the name of the Father," but the words turned to dust in his throat. He coughed violently, spewing hot embers onto his chest. He was starving for the truth, but he had spoken so many lies in his life that now he could not form a single true word. He was physically incapable of speaking the name of God without choking on the refuse of his own hypocrisy. I watched, horrified and mesmerized. As a judge, I had seen men break down on the witness stand. I had seen the toughest criminals weep when the sentence was read, but this was different. This was a man who still thought he had power, discovering that his power was the very instrument of his torture. Then the demons came. They did not look like the monsters in the paintings. They were not horned beasts with leathery wings. They were worse. They were shaped like servants. They were small, hunched, pathetic-looking creatures, wearing tattered rags that mocked the vestments of the priests. They carried silver platters and golden chalices. They approached the weeping leader. One of the creatures held up a chalice. It was beautiful, encrusted with gems. The creature bowed low, a mocking gesture of respect. "Drink, Holy Father," the creature hissed. The voice sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Drink the wine of your vineyard." The man looked at the chalice. He was parched. I could feel his thirst radiating off him. It was a thirst so deep, it felt like a drought in the soul. He reached out with trembling, burned hands and grabbed the cup. He brought it to his cracked lips and tipped it back greedily. It was not wine. Liquid fire poured out of the cup. It was molten lead, glowing orange. It poured into his mouth, over his chin, down his throat. He did not scream. He could not scream. The sound he made was a gurgling, hissing retch as the metal burned its way down his esophagus. Steam rose from his open mouth. He dropped the cup, clutching his throat, his eyes bulging in pure, silent agony. I backed away, stumbling. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to close my eyes, but my eyelids would not shut. I was forced to witness every second of it. "Why?" I whispered. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was hoarse and weak. "Why is he here? He did good works. He helped the poor." A voice answered me. It didn't come from the demons. It came from the man himself. He had fallen to his knees, the molten lead settling in his stomach, burning him from the inside out. He looked up at me, gasping for air, smoke curling from his nostrils. "I preached a gospel," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. But it was not his gospel. I preached myself. I loved the robes. I loved the seats of honor. I loved the power. He pointed a shaking finger at the void behind the altar. I did not know him. I knew his name. I knew his book. But I did not know Jesus. I never surrendered. I never repented. I only performed. His confession hit me like a physical blow. I thought of my own life. I thought of my courtroom. I thought of the way I sat in my high chair, demanding respect. I thought of how I loved the sound of my own voice reading a verdict. I thought of how I sneered at the simple faith of the people who came before me. I was no different from him. I wore a black robe. He wore a white one. I held a gavel. He held a staff. But inside we were the same. We were men filled with pride, men who built our own kingdoms and ignored the kingdom of God. We were men who thought we were the final authority. Suddenly, the air in the cathedral changed. The wall behind the altar, the black void, began to shimmer. It became a screen. It became a window. "Look," the demon with the chalice hissed at the priest. "Look at your harvest." The priest tried to look away, but invisible claws forced his head up. He had to look. I had to look. On the dark screen, images began to flash. They were not images of the past. They were live feeds. I saw people on Earth. I saw a young woman in a bedroom holding a bottle of pills, crying. I saw a man standing on a bridge looking down at the dark water. I saw a family sitting in a church listening to a sermon delivered by another man in a fancy robe. Then the images shifted. I saw souls falling. They looked like shooting stars, but they were dark, burning masses plummeting into the abyss. I heard their screams as they fell. They were calling out the name of this priest. "You told us we were safe," one voice screamed as it fell past us into the pit. "You told us rituals would save us. You lied. You didn't warn us about hell," another voice shrieked. "You only talked about love. You never talked about repentance." The priest on the floor writhed in agony. This was the true torture. It wasn't just the molten lead. It was the guilt. It was the weight of every soul he had misled. Every person who had listened to his watered-down sermons. Every person who had trusted in his religious system instead of trusting in Jesus Christ was now a stone tied around his neck, dragging him deeper into the flames. He was a murderer, not of bodies, but of souls. And the evidence of his crime was raining down around him. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead despite the heat. I looked at my own hands. Who had I hurt? Who had I misled? I wasn't a priest. I didn't preach. But I had a family. I had a wife who died believing in nothing because I told her religion was for fools. I had a son who grew up mocking God because he wanted to be like his father. I saw my son's face flash on the screen for a split second. He was sitting in a bar, his face gray and hopeless. My knees gave way. I collapsed onto the iron floor next to the priest. The heat seared my legs, but the pain in my heart was worse. I realized then that hell is not just a place of punishment. It is a place of clarity. It is a place where the truth is the only thing that exists, and the truth is a fire that burns away every lie you ever told yourself. I looked at the priest, a man the world called Holy Father. He was a husk of misery. He was a monument to failure. "There is no mercy here," he whispered, tears of black oil streaming down his face. The time for mercy was up there. We traded it for applause. The demon with the chalice turned to me. Its eyes were black pits. It smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It didn't offer me a drink. It offered me something worse. It held up a mirror. "And you, Your Honor," the demon hissed, mocking my title. "Are you ready to see the truth of your own verdict?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But in this place there is nowhere to run. The court was in session, and I was next on the docket. If this story is speaking to you, if something inside your heart is stirring, stay with me and take a moment to subscribe here to the channel. This is not just a video. This is an encounter with God. I stared into the surface of the mirror the demon held before me. It was not made of glass. It seemed to be cut from a slab of polished obsidian, dark and infinitely deep. It did not reflect the light of the fires burning around us, it absorbed it. The demon's clawed hand gripped the frame, which was made of bones, human finger bones fused together in an intricate, macabre pattern. "Look," the creature hissed again, its breath smelling of stagnant water. "The court is in session, Your Honor. Review the evidence." I did not want to look. I knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent 40 years determining guilt, that I would not like what I saw. In my life I had relied on the presumption of innocence, but here, in this suffocating heat, the presumption was guilt. We were all guilty. The only question was the degree of our corruption. I forced my eyes to the dark surface. At first I saw nothing but a swirling gray mist. Then the mist cleared and an image formed. I expected to see my face. I expected to see Arthur, the retired judge, the man of respect, the man who wore tailored suits and walked with a cane made of hickory. I expected to see the face I shaved every morning in the mirror of my bathroom in Portland. But the mirror in hell does not show your skin. It shows your soul. The figure in the reflection was grotesque. It was a man, yes, but a man made of stone. The skin was gray and cracked like dry mud in a drought. Where the eyes should have been, there were only two smooth, blank stones. I was blind. All those years I thought I saw everything. All those years I thought I had the sharpest eyes in the district. I had been spiritually blind. I had seen the law, but I had never seen the truth. I looked at the chest of the figure in the mirror. It was ripped open. Inside there was no beating heart. There was a cage of rusted iron ribs, and trapped inside the cage was a small, withered thing. It looked like a dried apple, shriveled and black. It was pulsing faintly, a weak, erratic beat that signaled a life wasted on self. That was my heart. It was the heart of a man who had never wept for the sorrow of another. It was the heart of a man who had shut out the world to protect his own comfort. I had confused stoicism with strength. I had confused indifference with impartiality. Then, the reflection shifted. The stone man in the mirror opened his mouth. But instead of words, moths flew out. Dozens of gray, dusty moths poured from the mouth, fluttering uselessly against the glass. I understood the metaphor immediately. It was a language of pain that needed no translation. The moths were my verdicts. They were my speeches. They were the lectures I gave to my son about responsibility. They were the judgments I handed down from the bench. In the eyes of the world, those words had weight. They changed lives. They sent men to prison. But here, in the light of eternity, they were dust. They were insects eating away at the fabric of my soul. I had spoken thousands of words in my life, but I had never spoken the only name that matters: Jesus. The demon lowered the mirror slightly, grinning with its needle teeth. Do you see the defendant? Do you see the crime? I was a good man, I shouted, but my voice was thin and weak in the cavernous hall. I paid my taxes. I never cheated on my wife. I upheld the law. The demon laughed. It was a sound like tearing metal. The law, it mocked. You upheld your law, the law of men, the law of pride, but you broke the first law every day you took a breath. It turned the mirror again. The image changed. Now it wasn't a reflection of me. It was a replay of a memory. I saw myself sitting at my kitchen table. I was younger, maybe 50. My wife, Martha, was sitting across from me. She looked tired. Her skin was pale. She had just come back from the doctor. She was holding a pamphlet about Jesus Christ and salvation. Someone at the hospital had given it to her. In the mirror, I watched myself. I saw the sneer on my face. I saw the way I snatched the pamphlet from her hand. We don't need this superstition, Martha, the Arthur in the mirror said. His voice was filled with such arrogance, such icy condescension. We are rational people. We face reality. We don't need fairy tales. I watched myself throw the pamphlet into the trash can. I saw Martha's face crumble. She didn't argue. She never argued with me. She just looked down at her hands, and the light in her eyes went out a little more. She died 6 months later. She died scared. She died without hope because I, her husband, the man who was supposed to protect her, had convinced her that hope was a lie. I screamed. I reached out to smash the mirror to destroy the image of my own cruelty. But my hand passed right through the dark surface. It was like putting my hand into freezing water. The cold burned me. I killed her hope, I whispered, falling to my knees again. I sentenced her to silence. You sentenced her to join you, the demon whispered, bringing its face close to mine. Its eyes were like burning coals. She is here, Judge. Somewhere in the dark. Do you want to hear her scream? No! I shrieked. The thought was unbearable. It was worse than the heat. It was worse than the smell of sulfur. The idea that my influence, my wisdom, had led the person I loved most to this place of torment was a weight that crushed me flatter than the pressure of the ocean floor. I was a fisherman once. I knew about nets. I knew about dragging things up from the deep. But now, I realized I had been dragging everyone I knew down. I had been a net of darkness, catching souls and pulling them away from the light. The demon pulled the mirror away and shattered it against the iron floor. The sound was deafening, like a gunshot. The shards of black glass scattered across the metal plates, and in every single shard, I saw a fragment of my sin. Not murder, not theft, but the sin of unbelief. The sin of pride. The sin of thinking I did not need God. The floor beneath me began to tilt. The iron cathedral was changing shape. The walls were stretching, pulling apart like taffy. The ceiling vanished, replaced by a swirling vortex of red smoke. I was sliding. The metal plates were slick with something oily. I clawed at the floor, breaking my fingernails, but I could not stop. I was sliding toward the center of the room, toward the place where the priests had gone. But I did not go to the altar of skulls. I slid past it, into a corridor that I hadn't seen before. It was narrow, lined with cages. I stopped sliding and scrambled to my feet. The heat here was different. It wasn't the dry, baking heat of the cathedral. It was a humid, sticky heat. It smelled of sweat and panic. I looked into the cages. They were small, barely big enough for a dog. But there were people inside. I saw a man in a business suit. He was on his hands and knees, frantically digging at the metal floor with a pen. He was muttering numbers. 4%, the quarterly projection, the bottom line. He was obsessed. He didn't even know he was in hell. He was trapped in the loop of his own greed. I saw a woman in a nurse's uniform. She was rocking back and forth, staring at her hands. "I didn't have time," she whispered. "I was too busy. I was saving lives. I didn't have time for church." I realized then that this was the hall of excuses. These were the people who had good reasons. These were the people who were too busy for God. They were the people who thought that being a good person was enough. I walked past them, my heart hammering. I knew I belonged here. I had a million excuses. I am a man of science. I am a man of law. I am too smart for religion. Suddenly the corridor opened up into a vast circular chamber. The floor was made of glass. Beneath the glass, far, far below, I could see a lake of fire. It was not a metaphor. It was a literal ocean of liquid flame, churning and boiling. The heat radiating through the glass was intense enough to blister the soles of my feet. But the true horror was in the center of the room. There was a pedestal, and on the pedestal sat a gavel. It was my gavel, the wooden mallet I had used for 20 years. It looked exactly like the one I left on my desk in Portland. But it was huge, the size of a man, and it was floating in the air, suspended by invisible wires. A voice boomed through the chamber. It was deep, resonant, and terrifyingly familiar. It was my own voice. "Court is now in session. The case of the Creator versus Arthur, the creation." I stood frozen. My own voice was judging me. "The charges are as follows," the voice thundered. "Rejection of the truth, idolization of the self, failure to love, failure to humble. The defendant is found guilty." The giant gavel raised into the air. I watched it go up into the darkness. I knew what was coming. When that gavel came down, it would shatter the glass floor. It would send me plunging into the lake of fire below. I looked around for a lawyer. I looked for a defense attorney. I looked for anyone to stand up and object. But there was no one. The cages behind me were silent. The demons were watching from the shadows, grinning. I was alone. For the first time in my existence, I realized the absolute necessity of an advocate. I realized why the Christians talked about Jesus as a mediator. Without him, you are standing in front of a cosmic judge with no defense, and the evidence against you is absolute. You cannot argue with your own life. You cannot argue with the condition of your heart. The gavel began to fall. It didn't fall fast. It fell slowly, agonizingly slowly, whistling through the air. It was the pendulum of my doom. I fell to the glass floor. I tried to cover my head. I tried to summon my dignity, the dignity of a judge. But dignity is a mask we wear on earth. Here, the mask was gone. I was just a terrified old man shivering on a sheet of glass over a pit of fire. "Objection!" I screamed. "Objection. I didn't know. No one told me it would be like this." But the voice, my voice, answered from the dark. "Overruled. You were told. The stars told you. The ocean told you. Your wife told you. You chose not to listen." The gavel was halfway down. The sound of its descent was like a freight train. I closed my eyes. I prepared for the impact. I prepared for the glass to shatter and the fire to swallow me. I knew I deserved it. That was the worst part. I wasn't a victim. I was a criminal who had finally been caught. But then, in the split second before the hammer struck, a thought pierced through my terror. It was a memory. Not of a courtroom, not of a law book, but of a boat. I was 20 years old. I was a fisherman out on the Grand Banks. A storm had hit us. A wave had washed me overboard. I was drowning. The water was freezing. I was sinking into the black. And as I sank, I remembered looking up and seeing the hand of the captain reaching down through the foam. He didn't ask me if I deserved to be saved. He didn't ask me for my resume. He just reached. I had grabbed his hand then. Now, lying on the glass floor of hell, I realized I needed a hand. But the captain I needed wasn't a man. The gavel was 10 feet away, 5 feet. I didn't scream a legal argument. I didn't scream a justification. I screamed the only thing that a drowning man can scream. I screamed a name. Jesus. I screamed it. I didn't whisper it. I didn't say it with the polite, hushed tone people use in church when they want to appear reverent. I screamed it with the raw, bloody desperation of an animal caught in a trap. I screamed it with every ounce of breath left in my burning lungs. I screamed it as a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Jesus, save me, I am guilty. I am guilty, but save me. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment that name left my lips, the entire physics of that dark world shattered. The giant gavel, which was milliseconds away from crushing my skull and sending me into the lake of fire, froze in midair. It didn't just stop. It hit an invisible barrier. It was as if the name of Jesus was a physical shield, a dome of titanium that had instantly materialized around me. The shockwave of the impact, the gavel hitting that invisible shield, knocked the wind out of me. But the glass floor didn't break. The fire below didn't swallow me. Instead, a sound erupted in the chamber. It was a shriek. But it wasn't human. It came from the shadows, from the cages, from the very walls of the Iron Cathedral. It was the sound of 1,000,000 demons crying out in unison, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain and terror. They couldn't stand it. They couldn't stand the vibration of that name. I had spent my life as a judge thinking that power came from the state. I thought power came from the police, from the prisons, from the statutes written in leather-bound books. I thought power was the ability to force someone to do your will. But I was wrong. Real power, absolute power, is the name of Jesus Christ. In that pit of despair where hope is mathematically impossible, that name was the only thing that had weight. It was heavier than the iron walls. It was brighter than the lake of fire. The giant wooden gavel, the symbol of my own judgment against myself, began to crack. A fissure appeared in the dark wood, then another, then another. It was vibrating, shaking apart because it could not exist in the same space as the plea for mercy. The law of sin and death was meeting the law of the spirit of life, and the collision was catastrophic for the darkness. I stayed flat on my face on the glass floor, covering my head with my hands. I was sobbing. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I was broken. The pride, the arrogance, the Judge Arthur persona, it was all gone. I was just a frightened old man, a former fisherman, admitting that he couldn't captain his own ship. I was admitting that I was lost at sea and I was going down. I am sorry. I wept into the glass. I am so sorry. For everything. For the pride. For the blindness. For Martha. For my son. For ignoring you. I surrender. I resign, God. I resign. I am not the judge. You are the judge. That was the key. It wasn't just the name. It was the resignation. It was the moment I handed over the gavel. Salvation is not a magic trick. It is a transfer of authority. For 78 years, I had sat on the throne of my own life. I had decided what was right and what was wrong. And I had driven myself straight into hell. Now, in the 11th hour, I was getting off the throne. The air in the chamber began to change. The sticky, humid heat of the hall of excuses was being pushed away by a wind. A fresh wind. It smelled like rain. It smelled like ozone. It smelled like the ocean before a storm clears. I dared to lift my head. The ceiling of the chamber, that swirling vortex of red smoke, was tearing open. It wasn't opening like a door. It was tearing like fabric being ripped by a giant hand. And through the tear, a light was pouring in. It is impossible for me to describe this light to you using human words. We have no reference point for it on Earth. The sun is a pale yellow bulb compared to this. This light was alive. It was white, but it contained every color in the spectrum. It was aggressive. It attacked the darkness. It didn't just illuminate the room. It annihilated the shadows. Wherever the light touched, the rusted iron of the cathedral dissolved. The cages melted. The glass floor turned into solid ground. And the light had a voice. It wasn't a voice of words. It was a voice of presence. It washed over me, and for the first time since my heart stopped on the pier, the pain vanished. The burning sensation in my skin stopped. The crushing weight on my chest lifted. I looked up into the light. I had to squint, tears streaming down my face. And I saw something descending toward me. It wasn't a ladder, it wasn't a rope, it was a hand. It was a massive hand, made of light, yet solid enough to crush mountains. But as it came closer, I saw the mark. In the center of the palm there was a scar. It was a hole, ragged and deep. It was the mark of a nail. I froze. As a judge, I had seen evidence of violence. I had seen autopsy photos. I knew what wounds looked like. But this wound was different. It wasn't ugly. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. That scar was the receipt. It was the proof of purchase. It was the evidence that my debt had been paid. I had spent my career demanding that people pay for their crimes. You do the crime, you do the time. That was my motto. But here was a hand that said, you did the crime, but I did the time. The realization broke me completely. The justice I had worshipped was flawed because it was human. Divine justice was satisfied by the cross. I didn't deserve to be saved. I deserved the fire. I deserved the gavel. But grace isn't about what you deserve. It's about who you know. The hand reached down. It grabbed me. It didn't grab me gently. It grabbed me by the back of my tattered, lead-heavy robe. It grabbed me the way a fisherman grabs a man who has fallen overboard in a gale. It was a grip of steel. It was a grip that said, I have you, and I am not letting go. I felt a sensation of upward velocity that was terrifying. I was ripped off the floor. The iron cathedral fell away beneath me. I saw the line of priests, the weeping pope, the businessmen in their cages. They all shrank into dots as I rocketed upward. I wanted to yell to them. I wanted to scream, call his name, just call his name. But the speed was too great. The wind rushed past my ears, sounding like a hurricane. We punched through the ceiling of hell. We punched through the layers of darkness. The sensation was like diving upward through heavy black water, breaking the surface into the air. The darkness vanished. The smell of sulfur vanished. Suddenly, I was suspended in a place of total white. There was no floor, no ceiling, just peace. A peace so profound, so thick that I could taste it. It tasted like clean water after a lifetime of drinking vinegar. I was not seeing Jesus face to face. I think if I had seen his face, I would have died from the glory of it. But I was in his arms. I felt an embrace that went through my soul. It was the embrace of a father holding a wayward son who had finally come home. And I heard a voice. This time it was gentle. It sounded like the ocean on a calm day. Arthur, the voice said. It knew my name. It knew me. My mercy is for the drowning. You have finally admitted you cannot swim. I tried to speak. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to pledge my life. But the voice continued. Go back. You have been a judge of men. Now go and be a witness of me. Tell them the verdict has already been read. Tell them the prison door is open. Tell them they do not have to die. I don't want to go back, I cried. It's cold there. It's hard. I want to stay here. Not yet, the voice said. Your net is empty, fisherman. Go back and fill it. Fill the net. The old command. The command I had followed as a boy on the boats. But now, the catch wasn't cod or haddock. The catch was souls. The light began to fade. Not because it was dying, but because I was moving away from it. I felt a pulling sensation, a heavy, sucking gravity dragging me down. I fought it. I reached up toward the light, clawing at the brilliance. No, please, don't send me back. But the gravity was stronger. I was falling again. But this time I wasn't falling into fire. I was falling into cold. I felt a slam. It wasn't the slam of hitting a floor. It was the slam of entering a heavy, dense suit, my body. Pain exploded in my chest. My ribs felt like they were broken. My throat was on fire. I gasped. The air that rushed into my lungs was freezing. It tasted of antiseptic and floor wax. I opened my eyes. The light was harsh and fluorescent. It hurt. I blinked, trying to clear the blur. I was lying on something hard and metal. A sheet was pulled up over my face. I panicked. I thrashed my arms, pushing the sheet away. I sat up, gasping, heaving, sucking in the air like a newborn baby. Screams erupted around me. I looked around. I was in a room with stainless steel drawers, a morgue. 2 orderlies were standing near the door. One of them had dropped a clipboard. He was backed up against the wall, his face white as a sheet, his eyes wide with horror. The other one was on the floor, scrambling backward on his hands and feet, shouting something in a language I didn't understand. I looked down at myself. I was naked. My body was purple and gray. There was a tag tied to my big toe. I was dead. I had been dead. "Help me," I croaked. My voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "Help me." The orderlies didn't help me. They ran. They burst through the double doors, screaming for a doctor, screaming that the dead man was awake. I sat there on the gurney, shivering. The cold of the morgue was biting into my skin, but I didn't care. I started to laugh. It was a wild, hysterical laugh that turned into sobbing. I touched my chest. My heart was beating. Thump, 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 thump. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I looked at the tag on my toe. It had my name, Arthur Vance. Time of death, 09:14 a.m. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 p.m. I had been gone for almost 6 hours. I pulled the tag off my toe. My fingers were stiff, but they worked. I swung my legs over the side of the metal table. My feet touched the cold tile floor. I stood up. I was weak, dizzy, and I felt like I had been run over by a truck, but I was alive. I walked over to a metal sink in the corner of the room. I looked into the polished steel above it. I saw my face. I looked older. The lines around my eyes were deeper. My skin was pale. But my eyes were different. The hardness was gone. The judge was gone. The stones were gone. There was a light in them now. A terrifying, humble light. I filled my cupped hands with water and splashed my face. I washed away the smell of the morgue, but I couldn't wash away the memory. I could still smell the sulfur. I could still hear the screams of the priest. I could still feel the heat of the gavel, and I could still feel the grip of that hand. A doctor burst into the room, followed by the 2 terrified orderlies and a security guard. The doctor stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me standing by the sink, dripping wet, naked, and alive. "Mr. Vance?" he stammered, his voice trembling. That is impossible. You have no pulse. You have no brain activity. You were pronounced dead this morning. We were prepping you for—" I turned to face him. I didn't feel superior to him. I didn't feel the need to explain the medical impossibility. I just looked at him with a love that I had never felt for a stranger before. "Doctor," I said, my voice gaining strength, "I have resigned." "Resigned?" he asked, confused, checking his own pulse as if to make sure he was the one awake. "Resigned from what? The bench?" "From the bench. From the pride. From the judgment," I said. I walked toward him. The security guard stepped back, hand on his weapon, terrified of the resurrected old man. "I have a new job now." What job is that?" the doctor whispered. "I am a fisherman," I said, "and I have a net to fill." I spent 3 days in the ICU. They ran every test known to modern medicine. They scanned my brain, my heart, my blood. They couldn't explain it. My heart, which had exploded on the pier, was functioning perfectly. The scar tissue they expected to see wasn't there. My arteries, which had been clogged with the debris of a Western diet, were clear. I was a medical miracle. But the real miracle wasn't my heart. It was my mouth. The old Arthur would have sued the hospital for distress. The old Arthur would have demanded a private room. The new Arthur spent every waking hour talking to the nurses, the janitors, the other patients. I told them what I saw. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told them about the Iron Cathedral. I told them about the priests with the molten gold. I told them about the Hall of Excuses. I told them about the gavel. Some of them laughed. Some of them thought the lack of oxygen had caused hallucinations. But some of them listened. I saw it in their eyes. The same fear I had felt. The same hunger for truth. There was a young nurse, a girl with tired eyes who changed my IV bag. She listened to me describe the hand of light. She started to cry right there in the room. She told me she had walked away from God years ago. She told me she thought she had gone too far to be saved. I grabbed her hand, not with a judge's grip, but with a father's grip. "My dear," I told her, "I was on the glass floor of hell. I was a split second from the fire. If his arm is long enough to reach me there, it is long enough to reach you here." She prayed with me right there, next to the beeping monitors. That was my first catch, the first fish in the net. When I was discharged, I went home to my empty house. I walked into my study. I looked at the walls lined with law books. I looked at my framed degrees. I looked at the photos of me shaking hands with governors and senators. I took them all down. I packed the books into boxes to donate to the library. I took the gavel from my desk, the real one, the wooden one, and I threw it into the fireplace. I watched it burn. It was just wood. It had no power. I sold the house. It was too big, too full of memories of the man I used to be. I bought a small cottage near the water, not far from the pier where I died. Now I spend my days walking the boardwalk. I look like just another old man feeding the seagulls, but I am on a mission. I talk to the tourists. I talk to the locals. I look for the people who look lost. I look for the people who have that judge look in their eyes, the look of pride, of self-sufficiency. And I tell them my story. I tell them that justice is real and it is terrifying, but mercy is real and it is available. I am tired now. My voice is getting raspy, but I have one more thing to say to you, watching this, listening to an old man's confession. You might be thinking, this is a good story, very dramatic. You might be thinking, he's just trying to scare us. I am not trying to scare you. I am trying to wake you up. You are sitting in a courtroom right now. You might not see the judge. You might not see the gavel. But the trial is happening. Every day you live without Jesus, you are building the case against yourself. You are weaving your own robe of lead. Don't wait until the gavel falls. Don't wait until the silence comes. Don't wait until you see the Iron Cathedral. There is a hand reaching down for you right now. It has a scar in the palm. It is reaching through the screen, through the noise of your life, through your doubts and your fears. Take it. For God's sake, take it. My name is Arthur. I was a judge. Now I am just a witness, and my testimony is closed.